The church bells of St. Mary's tolled 5 times across the misty morning air of Canterbury, their bronze voices carrying over thatched roofs still glistening with dew. Thomas Ashford, guild secretary to the worshipful company of mercers, pulled his woolen cloak tighter against the June morning's unexpected chill as he made his way through the narrow cobblestone streets toward the market square. The familiar weight of his leather satchel, worn smooth from years of daily use, rested against his hip, containing the precious vellum rolls where he recorded the guild's transactions, the quills he'd carefully trimmed the night before, and the small pot of iron gall ink his wife Margaret had mixed fresh that very morning. The ink's sharp, metallic scent mingled with the yeasty aroma of fresh bread wafting from the baker's quarter, where ovens had been burning since the deep of night. Thomas paused at the corner of Mercery Lane, as he did each morning, to observe the market square slowly coming to life. The great open space, bordered by timber-framed buildings that leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets, was already bustling with preparation for the day's trade. Merchants unfolded their trestle tables with practiced ease, the wood creaking and groaning as legs were locked into place. Canvas awnings, dyed in the deep blues and russets that marked each trader's station, unfurled like sails catching the morning breeze. His daughter, young Alice, had risen early to help him prepare, as was becoming her custom now that she had reached her 10th year. She walked beside him, her small hand occasionally reaching out to steady the basket of fresh parchments she carried, her other hand firmly clasped in his. Her wooden pattens clicked rhythmically against the stones, keeping time with their measured pace. "Father," Alice said softly, her voice still touched with the drowsiness of early morning, "why must the market begin so early? The sun has barely kissed the sky." Thomas smiled down at her, appreciating how her curiosity always emerged even through tiredness. "The market day begins when goods are freshest, little sparrow. The butter and cheese from the countryside, the fish brought up from the coast, the vegetables pulled from the earth just yesterday, all must be sold while they still hold their virtue. And we, as keepers of the guild's records, must be present to ensure all trades are fair and properly recorded." They passed the public well, where a line of servants and goodwives had already formed, their wooden buckets waiting to be filled. The ancient stone wellhead, worn smooth by countless hands, gleamed wetly in the growing light. The rhythmic creak of the windlass and splash of water created a soothing melody that had marked the beginning of market days for generations beyond counting. The revolution, as some had begun to call the recent stirrings among the common folk, seemed very far away on such a peaceful morning. Yet Thomas knew, as all guild officials did, that change was moving through England like a slow river, inevitable and patient. The old ways of bondage and servitude were being questioned, though here in the market square, life continued much as it had for centuries past. The Mercers' Guild House stood proudly on the eastern edge of the market square, its timber frame darkened with age to a rich, deep brown that spoke of decades of weather and wear. The building rose 3 stories, each level jutting out slightly over the one below in the style that maximized space in the crowded medieval town. Diamond-paned windows caught the early morning light, casting geometric patterns across the worn oak floors within. Thomas lifted the heavy iron latch, its metal cold beneath his fingers, and pushed open the thick oak door. The familiar sense of beeswax, used to polish the long council table, and the lingering smoke from yesterday's fire in the great hearth welcomed him home to his daily work. Alice followed, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light within, where tallow candles and iron sconces would soon be lit to illuminate the day's business. The main hall stretched before them, its high ceiling supported by massive oak beams that had been harvested from the wheeled forests a century past. Along the walls hung the shields of past guild masters, their painted devices fading but still proud, each one telling a story of merchant families who had built their fortunes through honest trade in fine cloth and precious goods. "Set the basket upon the writing desk, Alice," Thomas instructed gently, moving to the tall writing stand where he conducted much of his work. The desk, specially built to allow him to work standing better for the back during long hours of writing, held an array of quills, pen knives, rulers, and the various colored inks used for different types of entries in the guild books. As Alice carefully arranged the fresh parchments, Thomas began his morning ritual. First, he checked the previous day's entries, running his finger along the neat rows of text he'd inscribed. The records showed wool sales to Flemish merchants, imports of silk from Italian traders, and the careful notation of guild fees collected from junior members. Each transaction was recorded in the careful hand he'd learned as a boy, when his own father had first brought him to these very halls. "Father," Alice asked, settling onto a small stool beside his desk, "will you teach me the merchant's marks today?" Thomas considered his daughter's request. It was unusual for a girl to learn such things, but these were unusual times. The old certainties were shifting like sand beneath the tide. His own wife, Margaret, could read and cipher better than many men, a skill that had served their household well in managing accounts and correspondence. "Very well," he agreed, drawing a fresh piece of practice parchment toward them. "But first, you must understand that these marks are more than mere scratches upon the page. Each merchant's mark is like a seal, a promise of quality and honest dealing. See here." He drew a simple symbol combining a cross with a heart. "This is the mark of William Fletcher, the wool merchant. He cannot write his name, but this mark is known from London to Bruges, and it carries the weight of his reputation." Alice watched intently as her father's hand moved steadily across the parchment, creating the various symbols that marked the different traders. Her small fingers traced the shapes in the air, memorizing their forms. The morning sun had climbed higher now, streaming through the eastern windows and warming the hall. Outside, the sounds of the market were building, the calls of vendors, the lowing of cattle being driven to the butcher's stalls, the rumble of cart wheels on cobblestones, and the general murmur of hundreds of voices engaged in the ancient dance of commerce. As the guild house began to fill with other officers and merchants coming to record their business, Thomas knew it was time to return home briefly to break his fast with his family. This was the rhythm of their days, the early morning preparation at the guild house, then home for a meal, before the full day's work began in earnest. Their dwelling sat just 3 streets from the market square, a narrow but well-built house of 2 stories with a small solar that caught the morning sun. The ground floor served as Margaret's domain, where she managed not only their household but also a small trade in fine embroidered goods that supplemented their income. As Thomas and Alice entered through the low doorway, ducking slightly to avoid the lintel, the warmth of the kitchen fire embraced them. Margaret stood at the large table, her capable hands kneading dough for the day's bread. Their younger children, Robert, aged 7, and little Joan, just 5, sat on benches nearby, Robert practicing his letters on a wax tablet while Joan played with a wooden doll dressed in scraps from her mother's sewing. "Good morning, my loves," Margaret greeted them, flour dusting her forearms white. Her hair was neatly covered by a white linen coif, as was proper for a married woman, though a few dark curls had escaped to frame her face. The porridge is warm in the pot, and there's fresh butter from Goodwife Martin's cow. The family gathered around the solid oak table, its surface worn smooth from years of use, marked here and there with the scars of daily life, a burn from a too-hot pot, scratches from Robert's attempts at carving, the deep groove where Margaret's knife had slipped while cutting vegetables during her first pregnancy. Thomas led them in morning prayers, thanking God for the food before them and asking for protection in these uncertain times. The children bowed their heads dutifully, though Thomas could see Robert peeking at the honey pot that sat tantalizingly close to his bowl. "Father," Robert piped up once prayers were finished, "Master William says the villains in Essex are refusing to work their lord's lands. He says they want to be free men, like us town folk." Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret. The news of unrest had been trickling into Canterbury for weeks now, carried by merchants and travelers. He chose his words carefully. "Master William speaks true, Robert. There are indeed stirrings in the countryside. But we must remember that change, when it comes, should come through proper channels, through petition and law, not through discord." "But father," Alice interjected, her quick mind already grasping the implications, "did not the king impose a new tax?" "The poll tax? Mother says even the poorest must pay 4 pence, whether they have it or no." Margaret nodded, adding softly, "It bears hard upon those who have little. A man who earns but 2 pence for a day's labor must work 2 full days just to pay the tax for one person, and he has a wife and children besides." Thomas spread honey upon a piece of bread, taking his time to formulate his response. These were the conversations happening in households throughout England, he knew. The third poll tax in 4 years had pushed many beyond endurance. "The tax is law," he said finally, "and we must obey the law. But yes, it is a heavy burden for many. This is why your mother and I give what we can to the almshouse, and why we ensure fair prices in the market through the guild's regulations. We cannot change the great affairs of the realm, but we can act with justice and mercy in our own small sphere." Young Joan, uninterested in such weighty matters, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mother, will you tell us a story while we eat?" Margaret smiled, settling onto the bench beside her youngest. "Very well, sweet one. Let me tell you of your grandmother, and how she kept this household during the great pestilence, when I was younger than you are now." After the morning meal, the household dispersed to their various occupations. Thomas returned to the guild house with Alice, while Margaret supervised Robert's lessons before he would go to the parish school. Education, Thomas firmly believed, was the great elevator of fortunes, the key that could unlock doors closed to those who could neither read nor cipher. The parish school of St. Mary's was held in a small room attached to the church, where Father Benedict, an elderly priest with infinite patience and a gentle manner, taught a dozen boys their letters and numbers. The teaching was in Latin, of course, the language of the church and of all serious learning, though Father Benedict was known to explain difficult concepts in the common English tongue when young minds struggled. Robert carried his hornbook, a wooden paddle with a thin sheet of transparent horn protecting the precious paper beneath, on which were written the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. This simple tool was his most prized possession, a gift from his father on his 7th birthday, marking his entry into the world of letters. Meanwhile, at the guild house, Thomas had begun Alice's instruction in earnest. While she could not attend the parish school, such places were for boys alone, Thomas had determined that his daughter would not grow up ignorant. He had seen too many women cheated in business dealings, unable to read the contracts they sealed with their marks. "Now then," he said, setting before her a piece of parchment and a well-trimmed quill, "let us begin with the proper holding of the pen. See how I grip it. Not too tight, for that will make your hand cramp before a single document is complete, and not too loose, else your letters will waver like a drunkard's walk." Alice mimicked his grip, her small fingers finding their position on the quill shaft. Thomas guided her hand as she dipped the nib into the ink, showing her how to tap off the excess against the pot's rim to avoid blots. "The formation of letters is like the building of a house," he explained. "Each must have a strong foundation and proper proportions. Watch as I form the letter at 2 posts leaning together for support, with a beam across to hold them steady." As Alice practiced, her tongue peeking out in concentration, Thomas reflected on the changes he'd seen in his own lifetime. When he was a boy, even among the merchant class, literacy was far from universal. Now, more and more traders could at least sign their names and read simple contracts. The world was changing, slowly but surely, like a great wheel turning. The guild house had grown busy around them. Other merchants came and went, some to record transactions, others to settle disputes before they required the intervention of the town magistrates. Thomas performed his duties as secretary, writing out certificates of guild membership, recording the admission of new apprentices, and maintaining the rolls that showed which merchants were in good standing with their fees and obligations. Young Walter Carpenter, a boy of 14 newly apprenticed to Master John Woolman, stood nervously before the guild's assessment committee. Thomas prepared his quill to record the terms of the apprenticeship. "Walter Carpenter," intoned Master Woolman, a portly man whose red face spoke of too much good wine, "is bound to me for 7 years, to learn the art and mystery of the wool trade. He shall dwell in my household, and I shall provide him with meat, drink, apparel, and lodging fitting to an apprentice." Thomas wrote carefully, the Latin phrases flowing from his pen, "Artemi te mysterium lane mercatoris," the ancient formulas that had bound master to apprentice for generations. "And what are your duties to your master, young Walter?" asked the guild master, Richard Bennett, a stern but fair man who had risen from humble origins to become one of Canterbury's most successful merchants. Walter's voice cracked slightly as he recited the oath he'd memorized. "I shall faithfully serve my master, his secrets keep, his lawful commands gladly obey. I shall not contract matrimony within the said term, nor play at cards or dice tables. I shall not haunt taverns or playhouses, nor absent myself from my master's service day or night unlawfully." Alice watched this ceremony with great interest, understanding that this was how young men entered into trades, gained skills, and eventually became masters themselves. She wondered what path lay before her: marriage to a merchant, most likely, though her father's teachings had given her tastes for letters and numbers that few husbands would expect in a wife. As the sun reached its zenith, the market square had transformed into a bustling hive of activity. The morning's orderly preparations had given way to the cheerful chaos of commerce in full swing. Merchants called out their wares in sing-song voices that carried over the general din, each with their own particular cry that regular customers knew as well as friends' greeting. "Fresh fish, fresh fish. Caught this very dawn. Ribbons and laces, fine ribbons and laces. Hot pies. Beef and kidney. still steaming from the oven. Thomas made his regular inspection round with the guild master, ensuring that all weights and measures were true, that no unwholesome goods were being sold, and that proper order was maintained. Alice accompanied them, carrying the guild's standard measuring rod against which merchants' cloth lengths were checked. At the cloth merchants' row, they stopped to examine a dispute. Goodman Porter claimed that the Flemish weaver, Hans van der Berg, had sold him cloth that was not of the quality promised. The fabric in question, a length of fine blue wool, was spread upon a trestle table for inspection. "See here, Master Secretary," Goodman Porter pointed to several places in the weave. "The weft threads are loose, and there are thin spots where the wool was poorly spun." Hans, a tall man with the fair hair common among the Flemings, responded in accented but clear English, "The cloth is of second grade, as I told Goodman Porter." The price reflected this truth. He seeks now to claim first-grade quality for second-grade price. Thomas examined the cloth carefully, running his experienced fingers across the weave. Years of handling such disputes had taught him to read fabric like a book. The guild master waited for his assessment. "The cloth is indeed of second grade," Thomas pronounced, "but it is good second grade, suitable for working clothes or household use. If the price paid was for second-grade goods, then no deception has occurred." The guild master nodded. "Let the record show that the trade was fair. Goodman Porter, you have received what you paid for. If you wanted finer cloth, you should have paid finer prices." As they moved on, Alice asked quietly, "Father, how did you know the grade of the cloth so quickly?" "Feel his memory, little sparrow," Thomas replied. "These fingers have touched thousands of lengths of cloth. They know the difference between wool from Romney Marsh sheep and wool from the Cotswolds. They can tell if the thread was spun in winter, when cold makes the fibers brittle, or summer, when warmth makes them supple. Such knowledge comes not from books but from years of attention." They paused at the bakery stalls, where the guild's tasters were performing their duty, checking that the bread contained no chalk or sawdust to increase its weight, that the beer was not watered, that the meat pies contained actual meat and not just gravy and gristle. These were the small corruptions that the guild system existed to prevent, protecting both buyer and honest seller from the unscrupulous few who would profit from deception. The smell of fresh bread was intoxicating, and Thomas purchased a small loaf for them to share, the crust crackling as he broke it. The baker, Goodwife Elizabeth, was known throughout Canterbury for her skill, and her stall always had the longest queue. Master Ashford, she greeted him warmly, and young Mistress Alice. "How fare you this fine day?" "Well enough, good wife," Thomas replied, "though we hear troubling news from the countryside." Goodwife Elizabeth's face grew serious, and she lowered her voice. My cousin from Maidstone says the people there grow bold. They speak openly against the poll tax, and some have driven off the tax collectors with pitchforks and stones. 'Tis said they have a leader now, one Wat Tyler, a Tyler by trade, who speaks with a golden tongue about freedom and justice." "Dangerous talk," Thomas murmured. "The king's peace must be maintained." "The king is but a boy of 14 years, Goodwife Elizabeth countered softly. "His uncles rule in his name, and they care more for French wars than English suffering." This was treasonous talk, technically, though Thomas knew such conversations were happening in every market and tavern in England. The young King Richard II, crowned at 10 years old after his grandfather Edward III's death, was indeed ruled by a council of nobles who seemed more interested in continuing the expensive wars in France than in addressing the grievances of their own people. The afternoon brought a change in rhythm to the household. The market would continue until sunset, but Thomas returned home for the household's main meal of the day and to oversee the children's continued education. This was the time when the family gathered to share not just food but knowledge, stories, and the values that would shape the next generation. Margaret had prepared a substantial dinner, a pottage of barley and vegetables thickened with egg yolks, fresh bread, cheese from their own stores, and a special treat of honey-glazed carrots from their small garden behind the house. The family ate from wooden trenchers, though Thomas and Margaret each had a pewter spoon, marks of their middling prosperity. "Robert," Thomas addressed his son, "what did you learn from Father Benedict today?" The boy straightened, eager to show his progress. "We studied the story of David and Goliath, Father. Father Benedict says it teaches us that faith and cleverness can overcome brute strength." A timely lesson, Margaret observed quietly, and Thomas knew she was thinking of the current tensions between the common people and their overlords. "And what of your Latin?" Thomas continued. Robert's face fell slightly. "Latin is very hard, Father. Why must we learn a language that no one speaks in the market or the street?" Thomas set down his spoon, recognizing a teaching moment. "Latin, my son, is the key to all learning. Every important book, every legal document, every communication with educated men across all of Christendom is written in Latin. Without it, you are locked out of the great conversation of learned men. With it, you could read the words of Caesar, who walked these very roads 1,000 years ago, or St. Augustine, who teaches us how to live righteously." "Your father speaks truly," Margaret added. "Though I know only enough Latin for my prayers, I have often wished I knew more. When the Italian merchants come with their new patterns for embroidery, they write their instructions in Latin, and I must always find someone to translate." After the meal, while Margaret supervised Joan's simple needlework, the child was learning to make straight stitches on a practice cloth. Thomas gathered Robert and Alice for their arithmetic lesson. He had constructed a counting board, a wooden frame with lines marked upon it where bone counters could be placed to represent numbers. "Today," he announced, "we shall learn how to calculate compound interest, for this is the foundation of all serious commerce." He placed counters on the board to represent a sum of money. "Imagine you lend 10 shillings at 1 penny per shilling per month. How much will you receive after 1 year?" Alice's fingers moved quickly, counting. 10 shillings is 120 pence. 1 penny per shilling per month would be 10 pence per month, so 120 pence in the year, which equals the original sum again. "You would receive 20 shillings, Father." "Well calculated," Thomas praised. "But what if the interest were added to the principal each month, and interest charged upon the new sum?" This was more complex, and both children bent over the counting board, moving counters and frowning in concentration. Thomas watched patiently, knowing that struggle was part of learning. Through the open window, they could hear the sounds of the town, children playing in the street, the rhythmic hammering from the smithy, the distant lowing of cattle. "Father," Robert said suddenly, looking up from his calculations, "is it right to charge interest?" "Father Benedict says the Bible forbids usury." Thomas sighed. This was one of the great contradictions of their time. The Church teaches that charging excessive interest is sinful, yes. but reasonable recompense for the use of one's money, and for the risk that it might not be repaid, is permitted. The Italian banks have found ways to structure such arrangements that satisfy both commerce and conscience. It is a complex matter, one that learned men debate endlessly. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the household shifted into its evening rhythms. This was the time for the practical arts of household management, the skills that kept a medieval family fed, clothed, and sheltered through all seasons. Margaret supervised the preparation of the evening meal, a simpler affair than dinner, bread and cheese, perhaps some cold meat from the midday meal, and ale for the adults, watered for the children. But first came the evening chores that maintained their comfortable existence. Alice helped her mother in the solar, the private chamber that served as both Margaret's workroom and the family's retreat. Here, Margaret kept her embroidery frames, her precious collection of colored silks and fine wools, and the patterns she had collected over years of trading with merchants from across Europe. "See here, Alice," Margaret said, holding up a piece of fine linen on which she had begun an intricate pattern of intertwining vines and flowers. "This is called Opus Anglicanum, English work. Our embroidery is prized throughout Christendom. The Pope himself wears vestments decorated with English needlework." Alice examined the tiny, perfect stitches with amazement. Each one was no bigger than a grain of wheat, yet together they created images of stunning beauty and complexity. "How do you make the stitches so small and even, Mother?" "Practice, patience, and good light," Margaret replied. "But also, you must understand the nature of the thread and the fabric. Linen behaves differently from wool, silk differently from both. The needle must be chosen to match. Too large and it leaves ugly holes, too small and it cannot carry the thread properly." She demonstrated, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric with practiced ease. "This work will go to the cathedral, to decorate an altar cloth. The dean has commissioned it especially, and it will be seen by hundreds of faithful souls. Our work, though we are but women, thus serves God's glory." Meanwhile, Thomas had taken Robert to the small storeroom behind their kitchen, where the household supplies were kept. Barrels of salted fish and meat, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and precious spices locked in a small chest. These were their hedge against want and the foundation of household economy. A well-managed household, Thomas instructed his son, is like a small kingdom. Everything must be accounted for, nothing wasted. "See these marks I've made on the barrels? They tell us when each was laid down and when it should be used. The older stores must be used first, lest they spoil." Robert nodded seriously, understanding that he was being taught the skills he would one day need to manage his own household. "Father, why do we keep so much in store?" "The market is just streets away." "The market is there today," Thomas replied, "but what of tomorrow? When the great pestilence came in my father's time, the markets stood empty because so many had died or fled. Those households with good stores survived. Those without—" He shrugged expressively. "Besides," he continued, "a merchant must understand the seasons of plenty and want. Grain is cheap after harvest, dear before the next harvest comes. A wise householder buys when prices are low and stores against the time when they are high. This is prudence, not hoarding." They checked each barrel and sack, Thomas teaching Robert how to look for signs of spoilage, how to tell if mice had been at the grain, how to judge if meat was still good beneath its salt crust. These were not glamorous skills, but they were essential. As darkness fell, the family gathered in the main hall, where Thomas had built up the fire in the hearth. The dancing flames provided both warmth and light, casting moving shadows on the walls and ceiling. This was the time for prayer, reflection, and the sharing of stories that connected them to their past and prepared them for their future. The evening prayers were more elaborate than the morning's quick thanksgiving. Thomas led them through the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, and a special prayer for the king and realm. The children knew these prayers by heart, the Latin words rolling off their tongues with the ease of long practice, though Thomas suspected young Joan understood little of what she was saying. After prayers came the time for stories and instruction that was less formal but no less important than the day's lessons. Margaret had taken up her spindle, her fingers automatically drafting the wool into thread as she worked, the soft whir of the spinning creating a soothing background rhythm. "Tell us about grandfather," Robert requested. "About when he was young." Thomas smiled, settling into his chair. "Your grandfather, God rest his soul, was born a villain, bound to the land of Lord de Montfort. But he had a quick mind and skillful hands. The Lord's steward noticed that young John could carve wood like no other, making beautiful decorations for the manor house." The children leaned forward, though they had heard this story many times before. There was something magical about hearing how their family had risen from bondage to freedom, from poverty to modest prosperity. When the great pestilence came, Thomas continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller, "So many died that the old ways could not continue. There were not enough people to work the land, to practice the crafts, to maintain the old bonds of service. Your grandfather seized his chance. He walked away from the manor, though technically this was illegal, and came to Canterbury." "Wasn't he afraid?" Alice asked. "Terribly afraid," Thomas admitted. "But he used to say that fear of staying was greater than fear of leaving. He apprenticed himself to a carpenter here in town, worked every hour God sent, saved every penny he could. When his master died without heir, grandfather inherited the business. He made sure his sons, your Uncle William and I, received education, that we could read and write and cipher. Letters and numbers, he would say, are the tools that will keep you free." Margaret looked up from her spinning. "Your grandfather was a wise man. He understood that knowledge was the true foundation of freedom. A man who can read cannot easily be cheated. A man who can calculate knows the value of his labor." "Is that why the villains rebel now?" Alice asked thoughtfully. "Because they want what grandfather achieved." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances again. Their daughter was perceptive, perhaps too perceptive for her own good in these troubled times. "In part, yes," Thomas said carefully. "But also because the lords have tried to turn back the clock, to reimpose the old bonds that the pestilence loosened. The statute of laborers tries to force men to work for the same wages as before the death, though now workers are fewer and should command higher pay. It is like trying to push water back up a hill." The fire crackled and sparked, sending a shower of embers up the chimney. Outside, they could hear the watch calling the hour 9 of the clock, time for honest folk to be in their homes. The curfew bell would ring soon, after which anyone found on the streets without good reason would answer to the constables. The rhythm of medieval life was marked not just by the daily rounds of work and rest, but by the great cycle of holy days and festivals that gave shape and meaning to the year. Thomas, as guild secretary, was keeper of the calendar that governed both sacred observances and secular business. Tomorrow, he announced to the family, is the feast of Corpus Christi. The guild will process through the streets with our banner, and we shall have our place in the great procession. The children brightened at this news. Festival days meant a break from routine, spectacle and celebration, though also religious obligation. The Corpus Christi procession was one of the great events of the Canterbury year, when the consecrated host was carried through the streets under a canopy of rich cloth, with all the guilds, fraternities, and religious orders following in strict order of precedence. "Mother, may I wear my blue kirtle?" Alice asked eagerly. "The one with the silver buttons?" "If it still fits," Margaret replied with a smile. "You've grown so these past months. We may need to let down the hem." "And I'll carry the guild banner," Robert exclaimed. "Master Richard promised I could help the apprentices with it." Thomas nodded approvingly. "It's a great honor, Robert. The Mercer's banner has been carried in this procession for over 100 years. See that you hold it high and steady." These festivals were more than mere celebration. They were the glue that held the community together, moments when the strict hierarchies of daily life were both reinforced and temporarily relaxed. During the procession, the mayor would walk alongside the bishop, merchants would mingle with nobles, and even the poorest laborers would don their best clothes and participate in the communal expression of faith. "Your grandmother," Margaret told the children, used to say that Corpus Christi was her favorite feast because it celebrated the mystery of transformation, how simple bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, just as how simple people, through faith and effort, might transform themselves into something greater. Thomas added, "The guild plays also begin tomorrow. We're sponsoring the play of the Three Kings this year. The Mercers always take that one because we can provide the rich fabrics for the king's costumes. The guild plays, performed on pageant wagons that moved through the town, told the story of salvation from creation to the Last Judgment. Each guild took responsibility for a different play, often choosing stories that reflected their trade. The shipwrights performed Noah's Ark, the bakers the Last Supper, the pinners the Crucifixion." "Can we watch all of them, Father?" Joan asked sleepily from her mother's lap. "We'll see as many as we can, little one," Thomas promised. "Though you'll likely fall asleep before the doomsday play at the end." As the family prepared for bed, Thomas made his final rounds of the household, checking that the fire was properly banked, the doors barred, the shutters secured. These simple acts of security were second nature, inherited from generations of ancestors who knew that safety came from vigilance. In their bedchamber, as Margaret braided her hair for the night, she spoke softly to Thomas. "The rebels grow bolder. Goodwife Baker says her cousin in Gravesend saw a crowd of villagers refuse to pay the tax collector. They said they would pay no more until they could speak to the king himself." Thomas sighed as he removed his day clothes, folding them carefully on the chest at the foot of their bed. "The young king is said to be sympathetic to their plight. But his uncles, especially John of Gaunt, they see only the threat to their power and privilege. Where will it end, do you think?" "I know not," Thomas admitted. "But I fear that once the common people taste the possibility of change, they will not easily return to the old ways. We've seen it here in town, the journeymen demanding higher wages, the apprentices less willing to accept harsh treatment. "The world is changing, Margaret." "Is that such a bad thing?" she asked. "Your own father changed his station. Should not others have the same chance?" "Change through effort and lawful means, yes," Thomas agreed. "But change through violence and rebellion? That way lies chaos. And in chaos, it is always the innocent who suffer most." That night, as the household slept, Thomas lay wakeful for a time, his mind turning over the complexities of their situation. Through the thin walls, he could hear the night sounds of Canterbury, a dog barking in the distance, the occasional clatter of hooves as someone with permission to break curfew passed by, the creak and settle of the old house around them. He thought of his children and the world they would inherit. Would Alice find a husband who would value her education, or would she be forced to hide her light under the bushel of conventional expectations? Would Robert have the opportunities that Thomas had enjoyed, or would the current unrest destroy the careful structures that allowed for social advancement? In her small bed, Alice was dreaming of numbers and letters, seeing them dance across parchment like living things. Her father's teaching had opened a door in her mind that could never be closed. She dreamed of keeping accounts not just for a household but for a great enterprise, of ships laden with goods from distant lands, all recorded in her careful hand. Robert, curled under his woolen blanket, dreamed of being a great merchant like the Italian traders who came to Canterbury with their strange accents and exotic goods. He saw himself in a counting house, with clerks at his command, making deals that would echo across Europe. But underneath was another dream, barely acknowledged, a dream of a world where a man's worth was not determined by his birth but by his abilities. Little Joan slept the deep, untroubled sleep of childhood, her wooden doll clutched to her chest. She dreamed only of tomorrow's festival, of the bright banners and the music, of the honey cakes her mother had promised to buy from the baker's stall. Margaret, too, lay wakeful beside her husband, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where another child grew, though she had not yet told Thomas. She worried, as mothers always do, about bringing a new life into uncertain times. But she also felt hope, the same hope that had allowed Thomas's father to walk away from bondage, that had built this comfortable life they now enjoyed. The feast of Corpus Christi dawned bright and clear, with the promise of warm sun to dry the muddy streets and make the procession pleasant. The entire household rose earlier than usual, excitement overcoming the usual morning drowsiness. Even the church bells seemed to ring with extra enthusiasm, calling the faithful to the special early mass that would precede the procession. Margaret had laid out everyone's best clothes the night before. For Thomas, his finest doublet of deep blue wool, the one with silver buttons that marked him as a prosperous guild officer. For herself, a kirtle of rich brown with elaborate embroidery at the neck and sleeves, her own handiwork, which would be noticed and admired by other merchant wives. Alice helped Joan dress in her miniature version of adult finery, while Robert struggled with the points that attached his hose to his doublet, his fingers made clumsy by excitement. "Stand still, Robert," Margaret chided gently, coming to help him. "You cannot march in the procession with your hose falling down." The morning meal was hurried, just bread and ale, for they would feast later. Thomas checked and rechecked the guild's preparations. The banner had been removed from its place of honor in the guild hall, the rich crimson silk glowing in the morning light, the golden threads that spelled out Misericordia et Veritas, mercy and truth, catching the sun. As they walked to the church, They were joined by streams of other citizens, all in their finest attire. The usual distinctions of rank were maintained but somehow softened by the shared purpose. Even the poorest laborers had made an effort: a clean shirt, a ribbon for the women's hair, faces scrubbed until they shone. The Church of St. Mary's was packed to overflowing, the air thick with incense and the press of bodies. The Latin Mass washed over the congregation, most understanding only fragments but feeling the power of the ancient words nonetheless. When the priest elevated the host, everyone fell to their knees, the moment of transubstantiation marked by the ringing of bells. After Mass came the organizing for the procession. This was Thomas's responsibility for the Mercers Guild, ensuring everyone was in their proper place. The apprentices, including Robert, who beamed with pride, took their positions with the banner. The senior merchants arranged themselves by seniority, their wives beside them. Thomas noticed the subtle tensions even in this moment of supposed unity. The younger journeymen stood a little apart from their masters, their faces showing a new assertiveness. Some of the laborers at the back muttered among themselves, and Thomas caught fragments: poll tax, freedom, Tyler. But then the procession began, and such worldly concerns were temporarily forgotten. The bishop emerged from the cathedral carrying the consecrated host in a golden monstrance, sheltered beneath a canopy of cloth of gold carried by 4 senior clergy. Behind came the secular authorities, the mayor and aldermen in their robes of office, then the guilds in order of precedence. The Mercers, as one of the most senior guilds, were near the front. Thomas walked with dignified stride, aware of the eyes upon them from the crowds lining the streets. Alice and Margaret walked with the other wives and daughters, while Robert struggled manfully with his portion of the heavy banner. The procession wound through all the main streets of Canterbury, stopping at designated stations where small altars had been erected. At each station, prayers were said and hymns sung, the crowd's voices rising in unison. Even those who knew no Latin could join in the familiar responses, the rhythmic call and answer that had marked such festivals for generations beyond counting. At the station near the market cross, the guild plays began on their wheeled stages. The Mercers' play of the 3 Kings was third in sequence, after creation and the fall. Thomas watched with pride as the guild members performed the familiar story, the rich costumes he had helped procure lending dignity to amateur actors. The actor playing Herod, a young journeyman named Christopher, threw himself into the role with perhaps too much enthusiasm, ranting and raving about the threat to his throne. Thomas noticed some in the crowd exchanging glances. Was there not something of their own lords in this tyrant who feared losing power? Alice watched entranced as the 3 kings presented their gifts. The gold was real, borrowed from the guild treasury and carefully guarded. The frankincense filled the air with its sweet smoke. The myrrh, that bitter perfume associated with death, seemed to cast a shadow even on this bright day. "Why myrrh, Father?" Joan asked, tugging at Thomas's sleeve. "Why give the baby Jesus something so sad?" "Because even in joy, we must remember sorrow," Thomas explained quietly. "Even at his birth, his death was foreknown. It reminds us that all earthly things pass, that we must store up treasure in heaven rather than on earth." After their play, the family could relax and enjoy the others. The shipwright's Noah's Ark was spectacular, with real animals borrowed from various citizens, though the lions were rather obviously sheep in tawny painted wool. The baker's Last Supper was moving, the simple bread and wine transformed by the actor's reverence into something truly sacred. Between the plays, vendors moved through the crowd selling food and drink. Margaret purchased honey cakes as promised, and the family ate them while sitting on the cathedral steps, watching the constant flow of humanity. "Look, Father," Robert pointed. "There's Hans van der Berg. But why is he not with the other foreign merchants?" Thomas looked where his son pointed. The Flemish weaver stood with a group of English craftsmen, and they seemed to be in intense discussion. One of them Thomas recognized as James Turner, a man known for his radical views about workers' rights. "Perhaps he finds more in common with fellow craftsmen than fellow foreigners," Thomas said carefully. "The bonds of trade can be stronger than the bonds of birth." As afternoon wore toward evening, the plays continued. The Passion sequence was always the most moving, the crucifixion performed with such realism that many in the crowd wept openly. When Christ spoke the words, "It is finished," a hush fell over the entire square. But it was the final play, Doomsday, that seemed to resonate most strongly this year. As God separated the sheep from the goats, the saved from the damned, someone in the crowd shouted, "And what of the lords who oppress the poor? Where will they stand at judgment?" There was a moment of tense silence before the play continued, but Thomas saw the mayor's men moving through the crowd, looking for the speaker. The festival atmosphere, which had temporarily masked the underlying tensions, began to feel fragile. As darkness began to fall, the family made their way home through streets still crowded with revelers. Many would continue celebrating late into the night. The taverns would do excellent business, but respectable families with young children retired at a decent hour. Their own house seemed quiet after the day's excitement. Margaret prepared a simple supper while Thomas helped the younger children out of their finery. Alice, old enough to manage herself, carefully folded her blue kirtle, running her hands over the fabric thoughtfully. "Father," she said, "I noticed something today. The poor people, they watched the plays with such hunger, as if they were starving for the stories. Why do they seem to need them so?" Thomas considered his daughter's observation. "For many, Alice, these plays are their only education in Scripture. They cannot read the Bible, it's in Latin anyway, and they understand only fragments of the Massachusetts. But the plays, performed in English, with costumes and action they can see and understand, these teach them the great stories of faith. But it's more than that," Margaret added, bringing bowls of pottage to the table. "The plays show them that the mighty can fall and the humble can be raised up. That's a powerful message for people who feel crushed by their circumstances." "Dangerous message, more like," Thomas murmured, thinking of the shout during the Doomsday play. After supper, as they sat by the fire, Thomas brought out the household accounts to update. Even on a festival day, the work of recording and accounting must continue. He showed Robert how to enter the day's expenses, the offerings at church, the food purchased, the coins given to beggars as acts of charity required on holy days. "See how each expenditure has its place," he explained. "Necessities, obligations, charities, and luxuries. A well-ordered household knows how much goes to each category." While the men worked with numbers, Margaret was teaching Alice a new embroidery stitch, one that would create the illusion of gold thread without the expense of actual gold. "This is called underside couching," she explained. "The gold thread stays on top, never going through the fabric, so you need much less of it." "Like the festival today," Alice observed. "All gold and glory on the surface, but underneath, the regular threads of daily life continue. Margaret looked at her daughter with surprise and pride. "That's very perceptive, my dear." "Yes, exactly like that." Little Joan had fallen asleep on the rush-covered floor, exhausted by the day's excitement. Robert, too, was fighting to keep his eyes open, though he tried to focus on the accounts. The walk through the town, the weight of the banner, the press of crowds had worn him out. "To bed with you all," Margaret declared. "Tomorrow is a working day, and we must return to our regular duties." As the children were ushered up to their sleeping chambers, Thomas and Margaret remained by the fire a while longer. This was their time, when the responsibilities of parenthood could be set aside briefly, and they could speak as husband and wife. "I saw William Grindcob in the crowd today," Margaret said quietly. William was known as one of the most vocal critics of the Abbey's control over the town's mills. He was speaking with strangers, rough-looking men from the countryside. "I saw them too," Thomas replied. "There's organization happening, Margaret. This is not just spontaneous anger anymore. They're planning something. Should we think about sending the children away? To my sister in Oxford, perhaps?" Thomas shook his head. "That would mark us as afraid, as lacking faith in the king's justice. Besides, Oxford may be no safer than Canterbury. This unrest is everywhere." Margaret moved closer to her husband, seeking comfort in his presence. "I have news," she said softly. "I'm with child again." Thomas's face transformed with joy, then quickly shifted to concern. "In these times, children come when God wills, not when times are convenient," Margaret said firmly. "Your mother bore you during the pestilence years. We must have faith that this child, like our others, will find their way in whatever world emerges from current troubles." The days following Corpus Christi returned to their normal patterns, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. News came daily of disturbances in the countryside. The poll tax collectors were meeting increasing resistance, and in some villages, they had been driven off entirely. Thomas spent long hours at the guild hall, where the merchants gathered to discuss how to protect their interests in these uncertain times. The guild's strong room, where the treasury and important documents were kept, was reinforced with new locks and bars. "We must be prepared for anything," Richard Bennett, the guild master, told the assembled merchants. "If the rebels come to Canterbury, they'll likely target us. We represent everything they rail against: accumulated wealth, established privilege, the systems of trade that they claim oppress them." "But we're not nobles," protested John Woolman. "We're working men who've earned our prosperity through honest trade." "Try explaining that to a mob with torches," Richard replied grimly. Thomas was tasked with copying important documents, property deeds, royal charters, trade agreements, and distributing the copies to various members for safekeeping. If the guild hall burned, whether by accident or design, these documents would preserve their legal rights. At home, he began teaching Alice and Robert where the family's important papers were hidden, and what to do if trouble came. "This charter," he showed them, "grants our family freedom from villanage. Your grandfather earned it through 20 years of service to the town. Without it, we could theoretically be claimed as villains by Lord de Montfort's descendants." "But we've been free for decades," Robert protested. "Freedom is never permanently won," Thomas replied. "It must be defended in each generation. He also showed them the hiding place behind the false back of the kitchen cupboard, where the family's small store of silver coins was kept. "If something happens to your mother and me, this will see you safe to your aunt in Oxford." Alice paled. "Father, you're frightening us." "I'm preparing you," Thomas corrected. "Fear is not knowing what to do. Preparation is knowing exactly what to do." Margaret, meanwhile, was making her own preparations. She had begun storing extra food, quietly, without attracting attention. An extra sack of flour here, a wheel of cheese there, salted meat in quantities slightly beyond their normal needs. She also prepared bundles of clothing for each child, ready to snatch if they needed to flee quickly. She taught Alice how to hide valuables on her person, coins sewn into hems, small jewelry tucked into specially made pockets within her undergarments. "A woman traveling must be especially careful," she explained, "but also resourceful. Money hidden thus has saved many a family from destitution." It was a Thursday morning in early June when the storm finally broke. Thomas was at the guild hall, working on the quarterly accounts, when a breathless messenger burst in. "They're coming! The rebels! They've taken Rochester Castle and are marching on Canterbury." The guild hall erupted in panicked conversation. Some wanted to flee immediately, others to stand and fight, still others counseled negotiation. "How many?" Richard Bennett demanded. "Thousands," the messenger gasped. "Led by Wat Tyler himself. They say they mean to march to London to see the king, but they're stopping here first." Thomas immediately thought of his family. "I must go to them." "Go," Richard agreed. "All of you, see to your families. We'll meet back here at noon to decide our course." Thomas ran through the streets, his clerk's robes flapping behind him. The news had spread like wildfire, and everywhere people were either barricading their doors or standing in excited groups, discussing what this might mean. He found Margaret remarkably calm, already packing the essentials. "Alice, take Joan to the Goodwife Baker's house. She has a strong cellar where the children can hide if needed. Robert, help me with these bundles." "I want to stay with you," Alice protested. "You must protect Joan," Margaret said firmly. "That is your duty now." Thomas was proud of how his family responded to the crisis. No tears, no panic, just purposeful action. This was the fruit of preparation and training. But as it turned out, the rebels' arrival in Canterbury was not the violent assault many feared. They entered the city in the afternoon, a great mass of common people, peasants, craftsmen, laborers armed with agricultural tools and rough weapons, but disciplined under their leader's control. Wat Tyler himself, a commanding figure despite his common origins, stood in the market square and addressed the crowd that had gathered. "We come not to loot or burn," he declared, "but to seek justice. We go to London to speak with our king, to tell him how his people suffer under corrupt advisers and cruel laws. Any who wish to join us are welcome. Any who stand aside will not be harmed. But those who have oppressed the poor, who have enforced unjust laws, who have grown fat on the labor of others, they shall answer for their crimes." The crowd roared approval, and Thomas noticed that many townspeople were joining the rebels' ranks. Even some he knew: James Turner, as expected, but also surprising faces, apprentices from respectable guilds, even some journeymen who had seemed content with their lot. That evening, the Ashford family huddled in their hall, doors barred, listening to the sounds of the rebel army camping in and around Canterbury. There had been some violence, the sheriff's house had been ransacked, some lawyers' documents burned, the abbey's mills destroyed, but no general pillage. They seem more organized than I expected, Thomas admitted. This what Tyler maintains discipline. Some of our neighbors have joined them, Robert reported. He had been out, against his parents' wishes, observing. Tom the baker's son, William the carpenter, even some of the wealthier craftsmen. Fools, Thomas muttered. This can only end badly. The king may receive them, may even make promises, but once they disperse, the nobles will have their revenge. But father, Alice said thoughtfully, what if they don't disperse? What if this is truly the change grandfather hoped for when he left the manor? It was Margaret who answered. Change that comes through violence rarely lasts, my dear. And it always claims innocent victims. Your grandfather gained his freedom through patience, hard work, and taking opportunities as they arose. That is the lasting way. That night, none of them slept well. The rebel army sang songs around their campfires, songs of freedom and justice, but also songs that threatened vengeance on oppressors. The words carried clearly through the summer night. When Adam delved in Eve's span, who was then the gentleman? This simple rhyme, Thomas knew, contained the heart of the rebels' philosophy that in the beginning, all were equal, and that the hierarchies of their world were human inventions, not divine ordinations. In the morning, the rebels prepared to continue their march to London. Tyler and his lieutenants had requisitioned supplies, food, ale, some weapons, but had given receipts for everything taken, promising payment when their cause succeeded. Thomas watched from an upper window as the great mass of people moved out of Canterbury, heading along the London road. They were a ragged army, but an army nonetheless, united by grievance and hope in equal measure. There go men who will be heroes or corpses within a week, he murmured. Perhaps both, Margaret replied, joining him at the window. In the days that followed the rebels' departure, Canterbury slowly returned to normal, though it was a nervous normalcy. News filtered back from London. The rebels had camped at Blackheath. The king had agreed to meet them. There had been violence at the Tower of London where the Archbishop of Canterbury and the treasurer had been executed. The Guildhall became a center for information and rumor. Merchants with connections in London sent messages by fast riders. The news was contradictory and confusing. The king had granted the rebels' demands. The king had betrayed them. Wat Tyler was dead. The rebels were victorious. The rebels were scattered. Finally, more reliable news arrived. Young King Richard had indeed met with the rebels twice. At the second meeting, Wat Tyler had been killed, murdered, some said. Provoked into drawing a weapon, said others. The king, showing remarkable courage for a boy of 14, had ridden forward and declared himself the rebels' leader, promising to grant their demands for freedom and fair wages. But within days, those promises were revoked. The king's uncles and advisors had convinced him that promises made under duress were not binding. Royal forces were now hunting down rebel leaders across the kingdom. As I predicted, Thomas said grimly to the assembled merchants, the powerful never yield power willingly. But the effects in Canterbury were already visible. Those who had joined the rebellion were fleeing or trying to blend back into normal life. Some were arrested, others simply disappeared. The atmosphere was one of fear and suspicion. James Turner was arrested and taken to London for trial. His wife came to the Guildhall, weeping, begging for help. "He's a good man," she sobbed. "He only wanted fair wages for fair work." "Is that such a crime?" Thomas gave her what coins he could spare, knowing it was dangerous to be seen helping rebels' families but unable to turn away a woman in distress. Margaret would have done the same, he knew. Life slowly settled back into its routines, but nothing was quite the same. The rebellion had failed in its immediate aims, but it had planted seeds that would grow in years to come. The very fact that common people had marched on London, had spoken directly to the king, had for a brief moment made the powerful tremble. This could not be undone. Thomas resumed his teaching of Alice and Robert, but now their lessons carried deeper meaning. "What have we learned from these events?" he asked them one evening. Robert spoke first. "That the powerful always win?" "No," Thomas corrected. "That is too simple. What we've learned is that change must come gradually, through law and custom, not through sudden violence." "But father," Alice objected, "the rebels only turned to violence because legal channels failed them. They petitioned Parliament repeatedly about the poll tax and were ignored." "True," Thomas acknowledged. "And perhaps their rebellion, though it failed, will make the powerful think twice before imposing such burdens again. Sometimes the threat of disorder is enough to encourage reform." He pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. "Let me tell you what I think will happen. The old feudal bonds will continue to weaken. Not because of rebellion, but because of economics. The pestilence killed so many that labor is scarce. Scarce things become valuable. Workers will gradually gain more rights, better wages, more freedom, not through revolution but through negotiation backed by necessity." "Will we see it in our lifetime?" Robert asked. "You might," Thomas said. "Your children certainly will. Change is like water wearing away stone, invisible day by day, but over years, it reshapes the world." Margaret, listening from her sewing, added, "The rebels' cry, when Adam delved in Eve's span, won't be forgotten. Once people imagine equality, even if they can't achieve it, the imagination itself changes things." By late summer, Margaret's pregnancy was showing, and the household began preparing for the new arrival. This child, conceived in uncertain times, would be born into a world that had been shaken but not broken. Alice had taken on more responsibilities, effectively becoming her mother's deputy in household management. She could now run the daily operations, managing servants, purchasing supplies, keeping household accounts, with minimal supervision. "You'll make a fine merchant's wife," Margaret told her. "Or perhaps even a merchant yourself. I've heard that in London, some widows run their late husband's businesses as well as any man." "I don't want to be a widow," Alice said quickly. "No one does," Margaret replied. "But we must be prepared for all possibilities. The pestilence taught us that." Robert, meanwhile, was advancing in his studies. Father Benedict had recommended him for additional instruction in Latin and rhetoric, subjects usually reserved for those intended for the church or law. "The boy has a gift," the priest told Thomas. "He could go to Oxford, perhaps, become a clerk or even a lawyer." Thomas was torn. He had always assumed Robert would follow him into trade, eventually taking over his position as guild secretary. But shouldn't a father want his son to rise as high as his talents could take him? "We'll see," he told the priest. There's time yet to decide. The harvest season brought its own rhythms and requirements. The guild organized the Lammas feast, celebrating the first grain harvest. Despite the recent troubles, or perhaps because of them, the celebration was particularly joyous. People needed to affirm life and community after coming so close to chaos. Thomas supervised the guild's contribution to the feast: bread baked from the new grain, ale brewed fresh, meat purchased from guild members who raised livestock. The feast was held in the guild hall, with members and their families gathering in fellowship. As autumn deepened toward winter, the Ashford household fell into the comfortable rhythms that had sustained families through countless generations. The great events of the rebellion seemed to fade into history, though their effects continued to ripple through society in ways both subtle and profound. Thomas noticed changes in the way apprentices spoke to their masters, still respectful, but with a new undertone of expectation for fair treatment. The guild had quietly raised wages for journeymen, recognizing that keeping skilled workers was better than losing them to other towns or trades. One evening, as rain pattered against the shutters and the family gathered around the fire, Thomas reflected on the lessons of the year. "We live in ordinary times again," he said. "But ordinary times are where life is truly lived. The great events, wars, plagues, rebellions, these are interruptions. The real work of living happens in the daily round of work, prayer, teaching, and love." Alice was helping Joan with her first letters, showing the same patience Thomas had shown with her. Robert was reading aloud from a book of travels, his Latin now fluent enough to manage complex texts. Margaret worked on her embroidery, the new life within her making her movements slower but no less graceful. "Tell us a story, Father," Joan requested. "A story about ordinary people doing ordinary things." Thomas smiled. "Very well. Let me tell you about a typical day in the life of a guild secretary, from dawn to dusk, with all its small dramas and quiet satisfactions." And so he began to weave a tale of ledgers and contracts, of disputes resolved and bargains made, of the 100 small decisions that kept a medieval town functioning. It was not a tale of heroes and villains, but of people trying to live decent lives in challenging times. As winter settled over Canterbury, the household adapted to the season's demands. The days were short, darkness falling by late afternoon, requiring careful management of candles and lamp oil. The guild hall's great fireplace roared constantly, fed by the wood tax each member contributed. Thomas taught his children how medieval people survived winter, the importance of warm clothing, properly seasoned firewood, and stored food. "Winter is the test of summer's providence," he explained. "Those who prepared well lived comfortably. Those who didn't suffer until spring." The winter markets were different from summer's abundance. Root vegetables dominated: turnips, parsnips, carrots stored in sand, preserved meats and fish. The last of the season's apples, carefully kept in cool cellars. Prices were higher, but the guild's regulations prevented excessive profiteering. Margaret's time was approaching, and the household began preparations for the birth. The midwife, Goodwife Helen, visited regularly, checking Margaret's health and instructing Alice in the preparations needed: clean linens, heated water, the herbs that would ease labor pains. "This knowledge too is important," Margaret told Alice. "Men may run the world of commerce and law, but women govern birth and death, the great passages of life." One particularly cold evening, As snow fell silently outside, coating Canterbury in pristine white, the family received an unexpected visitor. It was Christopher, the journeyman who had played Herod in the Corpus Christi play. But now he looked haggard, afraid. "Master Ashford," he said, shivering at their door, "I beg your help. I joined the rebels when they passed through. I marched to London. I've been hiding since returning, but they're arresting men. I need to leave Canterbury, go to France perhaps, start anew. Could the guild?" Thomas faced a moral dilemma. Helping a known rebel was dangerous. But Christopher was a guild member, and the guild protected its own. "Wait here," Thomas said. He returned with a small purse of silver and a letter. "This introduces you to a merchant in Dover who owes me favors. He'll arrange passage to Calais. In France, seek out the English merchants' quarter. Your skills will serve you there." Christopher's gratitude was profound. "I'll repay this, Master Ashford." "Repay it by living well and causing no more trouble," Thomas replied. After Christopher left, disappearing into the snowy night, Thomas found Margaret watching him. "That was dangerous," she said. "It was right," he replied. "The boy made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to hang for it." Margaret's labor began on a cold December night, just a week before Christmas. Thomas sent Robert running for the midwife while Alice helped her mother to the birthing chamber they had prepared. Joan was sent to stay with neighbors, too young to witness what was to come. The labor was long but not unusual. Thomas paced the hall below, listening to the sounds from above: Margaret's controlled breathing, the midwife's calm instructions, Alice's voice offering comfort. This was women's business, but that didn't make the waiting easier for him. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered rooftops pink and gold, a new cry joined the sounds of the household, the vigorous wail of a healthy infant. "A son," the midwife announced from the top of the stairs. "Small but strong, and your wife as well." Thomas climbed the stairs with trembling legs, entering the warm, herb-scented chamber where Margaret lay exhausted but smiling, a swaddled bundle in her arms. "Meet Edmund," she said. Named for the martyr king, born in a time of trials to grow strong through adversity. The baby was indeed small, but his grip was strong when Thomas offered his finger. Here was the future, Thomas thought, this child who would grow up in a world changed by the rebellion, even if that change came slowly. The community celebrated the new birth as they did all such events, with gifts of food, offers of help, and prayers for the child's health. The guild recorded Edmund's birth in their rolls, noting the date and the star's positions, as was customary. Father Benedict came to baptize the child, performing the sacrament in the parish church with Robert and Alice standing as godparents to their new brother. The holy water was cold, causing Edmund to cry vigorously, which everyone took as a sign of strength and vitality. Christmas in medieval Canterbury was not a single day but a full 12-day celebration stretching from the Nativity to Epiphany. It was a time when the usual rules relaxed, when masters served servants at feast, when the boy bishop ruled in playful reversal of normal hierarchies. The Ashford household embraced the season fully. Thomas had saved throughout the year to provide a proper celebration: a goose for Christmas Day, spiced wine, the precious oranges that came from Spain, costing more than a laborer earned in a week but marking prosperity and generosity. On Christmas Eve, the family attended midnight mass, baby Edmund wrapped warmly against the cold. The church was packed, the congregation's breath visible in the frigid air, but the solemnity and beauty of the service transcended physical discomfort. When the choir sang Gloria in Excelsis Deo, their voices seemed to pierce heaven itself. Christmas Day brought feasting and gift-giving. Thomas had commissioned a new dress for Margaret, deep green wool that complemented her coloring. For Alice, a small book of hours, with illuminated letters that would help her practice reading. Robert received a penknife of finest steel for trimming quills. Even little Joan had a gift, a new doll with a painted face, far finer than her old wooden toy. But the gifts were less important than the gathering itself. Thomas's brother William came from his farm outside Canterbury, bringing his family. Margaret's sister arrived from Oxford, full of news from that university town. The house, usually orderly, filled with laughter, argument, and the chaos of extended family. #### Chapter 23 continued. On St. Stephen's Day, the second day of Christmas, the traditional reversal of roles took place. Thomas served breakfast to the household's 2 servants, while Margaret and Alice prepared the meal. It was a reminder, sanctioned by tradition, that all stations in life were temporary, that servant and master were equal in God's eyes. This custom, Thomas explained to Robert, who watched with amazement as his father carried plates like a servant, reminds us of humility. Christ himself washed his disciples' feet. No honest work diminishes a person's dignity. The Guildhall hosted its annual feast on the Feast of St. John, where the members' families gathered for entertainment and fellowship. A traveling minstrel had been hired, and he sang songs of Arthur and his knights, of Charlemagne and his paladins, stories that transported the listeners to worlds of noble deeds and chivalric honor. But he also sang newer songs, carefully worded ballads about common people seeking justice, about the dignity of labor, about the hope for a better world. Thomas noticed how these songs made some of the older guild members uncomfortable while the younger ones leaned forward, eager to hear every word. "The world is changing even in our songs," Margaret observed quietly to Thomas. The old tales of kings and knights share space now with stories of ordinary folk. As the Christmas season drew to a close with Twelfth Night celebrations, Thomas took time to update the family chronicle he had been keeping. By candlelight, while the household slept, he wrote carefully. "In this year of our Lord 1381, great tumults have shaken the realm. The common people, pressed beyond endurance by taxes and oppression, rose in rebellion. Though their immediate aims failed, methinks the seeds of change have been planted deep in English soil. My children shall grow up in a world different from the one into which I was born, though how different only God knows." He paused, considering what else to record for posterity. Then continued. "Yet life goes on in its ancient patterns. Children are born, couples marry, the old die and are mourned. The markets open each day, craftsmen ply their trades, the seasons turn in their eternal dance. Perhaps this is the true lesson, that beneath the great events that historians will record, ordinary people continue living, loving, working, and hoping." Young Edmund stirred in his cradle near the fire, making the small sounds of infant dreams. Thomas rose to check on him, adjusting the blankets, marveling at the perfection of tiny fingers and toes. This child would never know the world as it had been before the rebellion. For him, the changes now beginning would simply be the way things were. January brought the deepest cold of winter. The Thames froze solid enough for frost fairs, though Canterbury's smaller river store merely skinned over with ice that glittered like diamonds in the weak winter sun. The market square was often empty save for the hardiest vendors, their breath clouding as they stamped their feet and huddled near braziers. In the Ashford household, life turned inward. This was the season for indoor crafts, for teaching, for the patient work that didn't require good light or warm weather. Margaret worked on an elaborate altar cloth she'd been commissioned to create, the work so fine it could only be done in short bursts lest her eyes tire. Alice had progressed remarkably in her studies. She could now not only read and write in English but had a good grasp of Latin and even some French, the language of nobility and international trade. Thomas tested her by having her translate trade documents from the Italian merchants. "You have a gift," he told her. "Your mind grasps languages as easily as your mother's fingers grasp the needle." Robert, meanwhile, was struggling with a different kind of learning. Thomas had begun teaching him the art of negotiation, using real guild disputes as examples. "Suppose," Thomas posed, "Master Smith claims Master Cooper owes him 10 shillings for iron hoops, but Master Cooper says the hoops were faulty and broke within a week. How do you resolve this?" Robert thought carefully. "Examine the broken hoops to see if the fault was in the iron or in the use." "Good start. What else?" "Ask if there were witnesses to the agreement. Check if Master Smith has had other complaints about his work." "Excellent. You're learning that truth in business disputes is rarely simple. Both parties usually believe themselves right. The art is finding a resolution that preserves both dignity and justice." As February gave way to March, the first hints of spring began to appear. The days grew marginally longer, though cold rains replaced snow, turning the streets to mud. This was the hungry time, when winter stores ran low but new growth hadn't yet begun. The guild organized relief for the poorest citizens, distributing grain and preserved foods to prevent starvation. Thomas supervised this charity work, ensuring fair distribution and keeping careful records. "Why must we write down every measure of grain given?" Robert asked, helping his father with the records. "For 2 reasons," Thomas explained. "First, to ensure no one claims twice, depleting stores meant for others. Second, to show the town authorities and our own members that the guild's charity is well managed. Trust requires verification." One rain-soaked afternoon, a stranger appeared at the guild hall. He was well-dressed but travel-worn, speaking English with a slight accent Thomas recognized as educated London speech. "I seek Thomas Ashford," he announced. "I bring news from Christopher, formerly of this guild." Thomas received him privately. The man was a merchant from Calais, where Christopher had indeed found work with English traders. "He prospers," the merchant reported. "His skills were much needed. He sends this," producing a small purse, "to repay your kindness, with interest. He also sends warning. The king's agents are still seeking rebels who fled. Some have been tracked to France. Christopher has moved on to Bruges for safety." Thomas accepted the repayment thoughtfully. "Tell him his debt is cleared, and I wish him well in his new life." After the merchant left, Thomas reflected on how the rebellion had scattered people like seeds in the wind. Some would take root in new soil, perhaps growing stronger for the transplanting. As Lent began, the household entered the period of fasting and reflection that preceded Easter. No meat, limited meals, extra prayers. These mortifications of the flesh were meant to focus the spirit on holy matters. But for medieval people, Lent was also a practical necessity. By late winter, preserved meats were running low anyway, and fresh meat wouldn't be plentiful until spring lambs and calves were ready. The church's calendar aligned with agricultural reality. Margaret, still recovering from childbirth, was exempt from the strictest fasting, but she limited herself nonetheless. "We must set an example," she told the children. "How can we teach sacrifice if we don't practice it ourselves?" The guild's business continued despite Lent. Indeed, some trades did better, fishmongers especially, as everyone sought alternatives to meat. Thomas recorded higher than usual sales of dried cod, pickled herring, and fresh fish brought from the coast. One day during Lent, Alice accompanied her father to a special guild meeting. The members were discussing whether to accept a new innovation, a system of written contracts for all major trades, not just international ones. "It's unnecessary," argued Master Woolman. "A man's word and his mark have been sufficient for generations." "But times change," countered a younger member. "With written contracts, disputes can be resolved by reference to the document, not fading memories." Thomas was asked his opinion as secretary. "Written contracts protect both parties," he said carefully. "They're not a sign of distrust but of clarity. How many disputes have I recorded that arose from honest misunderstanding about terms agreed months before?" The debate continued, but Thomas could see which way the wind was blowing. Literacy was spreading, and with it came documentation. The world of handshakes and verbal agreements was slowly giving way to one of written records. Easter arrived with glorious spring weather, as if nature itself celebrated the resurrection. The household rose before dawn for the Easter vigil, watching as the new fire was kindled and the Paschal candle lit, its flame representing Christ's triumph over death. After weeks of fasting, the Easter feast tasted miraculous. Margaret had saved and planned carefully. There was lamb, fresh bread, eggs colored with onion skins and other natural dyes, early greens from the garden, and precious sugar formed into the shape of a lamb. But the joy of Easter was tempered by news from London. The king's counselors had completed their reprisals against the rebels. Hundreds had been executed, their heads displayed on London Bridge as warning. The promises of freedom and reform had been entirely revoked. "When Adam delved and Eve span" was now a dangerous phrase to speak aloud. Yet in Canterbury, subtle changes persisted. Wages remained higher than before the rebellion. Lords were more careful in their demands. The poll tax was quietly abandoned, never to be imposed again. The rebels lost, Thomas told his family, but there was one small victories. Sometimes that's how real change happens, not in grand gestures but in small, permanent alterations. That evening, as the family sat in their hall, young Edmund, now 4 months old and beginning to smile, Thomas reflected on the year that had passed. They had witnessed history, survived uncertainty, welcomed new life, and continued the ancient patterns of work, worship, and family. As spring deepened into early summer, Canterbury burst into full life again. The markets overflowed with fresh produce, the days stretched long and warm, and the crisis of the previous year seemed like a distant dream. Yet reminders persisted. Some faces were missing from the guild meetings, men who had joined the rebellion and never returned. Others bore a new weariness, a recognition that the social order they had thought permanent could be shaken. Thomas had begun teaching Edmund's first lessons, though the baby could barely sit upright. "It's never too early," he told Margaret, moving the child's hand to touch different textures: smooth wood, rough wool, cold metal. "The mind begins learning from birth." Alice had received a proposal of marriage from a merchant's son in London. The young man was respectable, his prospects good, but Alice had asked for time to consider. "I'm not yet ready to leave my studies," she told her parents. "There's still so much to learn." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. This too was a sign of changing times, a young woman having say in her marriage, prioritizing education over immediate matrimony. "You shall have time," Thomas assured her. "Marriage is too important to rush." Robert had made a decision of his own. "Father, I want to continue my education, perhaps to become a lawyer. Father Benedict says I have the capability." Thomas felt both pride and loss. He had hoped Robert would succeed him as guild secretary, but he wouldn't stand in his son's way. "If that's your calling, we'll find the means," he promised. On the anniversary of the rebels' march through Canterbury, the town was quiet. No one wanted to commemorate what was now considered treason, but neither could they forget entirely. Thomas stood in the market square at dawn, as he did each market day, watching the eternal dance of commerce begin again. Merchants setting up stalls, customers arriving, the age-old rhythm of buying and selling that had continued through plague, war, and rebellion. Hans van der Berg, the Fleming weaver, approached him. "Master Ashford, a word?" They spoke quietly of trade matters, but then Hans said something significant. "My son, born here in Canterbury, speaks English as his first tongue. He thinks of himself as English, not Fleming. Is this not how peoples merge? Not through conquest but through commerce and community?" Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's the true revolution, not violence in the streets but the slow mixing of peoples, ideas, customs, until the old divisions no longer matter." As the day progressed, Thomas performed his usual duties, but with a sense of completing a circle. A year ago, he had stood in this same square, worried about revolution. Now, life had returned to its patterns, but those patterns had subtly shifted. The apprentices were treated better. The journeymen earned more. Even the servants had gained new dignities. The rebellion had failed, but its spirit had seeped into the fabric of daily life like rain into soil. That evening, as the family gathered for supper, Thomas asked each child what they had learned that day. Joan, now 6, proudly recited her numbers. Robert discussed a point of Latin grammar. Alice shared an insight about Italian bookkeeping methods. Even baby Edmund contributed, babbling happily and reaching for everything on the table with chubby fingers. "Each day we learn, we grow, we change," Thomas said. "That's the true revolution, the one that happens in countless households, in countless small ways, until one day we wake to find the world transformed." Margaret added the final wisdom, "And through it all, we maintain what matters most: family, faith, community. These are the constants that allow us to weather any storm." As summer deepened toward autumn, Thomas completed his chronicle of the year. Writing by candlelight while his family slept peacefully around him, he set down his final thoughts. Future readers may wonder what it was really like during the revolution that failed. Let me tell you, it was days of fear mixed with weeks of ordinary life. It was grand principles debated in taverns and practical compromises made in guild halls. It was the death of old certainties and the birth of new possibilities. But mostly, it was families like ours continuing to live, work, and hope. We rose each day, said our prayers, did our work, taught our children, loved our spouses, aided our neighbors. The great wheel of history turned, but the small wheels of daily life turned too, and in their turning lay the real story of our times. The rebels cried for freedom and justice. They didn't achieve what they sought, not immediately. But every child who learns to read, every worker who earns fair wages, every person who rises through merit rather than birth, these are the rebellion's true victories, achieved not through violence but through the patient work of ordinary days. My children will live in a different world than I was born into. Their children's world will differ even more. This is the way of things, change coming not like thunder but like the tide, inevitable and patient. And so we end where we began, in a house on a street in Canterbury, where a family sleeps safely, their bellies full, their futures uncertain but hopeful. The revolution came and went, but life continues its ancient patterns, forever the same, forever changing. May God grant us all peaceful sleep and hopeful mornings. Amen. Thomas set down his quill, sanded the wet ink, and closed the chronicle. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. But tonight, all was well in the Ashford household, and that, perhaps, was revolution enough. The candle flickered and died, leaving only the banked fire's gentle glow and the soft breathing of sleeping children, the sounds that had lulled families to sleep since time immemorial, the sounds that would continue long after the great events of 1381 had faded into history. And in that quiet darkness, as Thomas made his way to bed, he reflected that perhaps the rebels had won after all, not through force of arms but through planting in human hearts the unquenchable idea that tomorrow could be different from today, that ordinary people deserved dignity and justice, that the world, unchangeable as it seemed, could indeed be changed. With that thought, he joined his sleeping family. Another day ended, another yet to come, the great will turning ever onward into an uncertain but hopeful future.